Carl Thomas has been many things: a pioneer in the triathlon community, C-suite growth executive, and a trusted mentor for established business owners and aspiring entrepreneurs alike. With decades of leadership experience for companies including Universal Studios, Tickets.com, and most recently, Hookit, Carl attributes much of his success to his ability to see around corners. Carl is now at the tail end of a 2-week self-quarantine following his return from a trip to Europe. Carl, when you arrived in Europe, had COVID-19 yet presented any serious concern?
Yes, I'll say in a moderate way, Sarah. We traveled with 6 other people, so 8 of us total. And kind of the week before, we all decided to push the go button, that it wasn't so serious, at least at that moment in time, that would have impacted anyone opting not to go.
Sure. When did you realize that the situation had escalated?
Well, it was escalating as we arrived in Austria. Even though the airports that we traveled through, Heathrow, and we landed in Zurich, everything was reasonably calm. We saw very little incidence of masks, but obviously the news and the news cycle, and in particular what was happening in Italy, bordering country to both Switzerland and Austria, did begin to sort of raise awareness for sure, and, if you will, a little bit of escalating concern.
Sure. What did you decide to do when you realized that your resort was clearing out?
Well, let me first say that the first 5 days of our stay, it was a 7-day stay, were awesome. I mean, all the people, all the restaurants, all the things that you would expect in an alpine resort, in particular the Austrian Alps, was terrific. People were great. The hospitality was great. The attitudes were all great. But as the week wore on, for example, 2 of our companions had originally scheduled their trip to go to both Malta and Sicily. And with the rising concern in Italy, and obviously airlines beginning to take note, they opted to cancel their itinerary midweek. So they were sort of dealing with how to rebook and where to rebook to. As far as we were concerned, we were always scheduled 7 days in Austria and then the last 5 days of the holiday in Switzerland. It was really on the Friday morning, call it Friday the 13th, March 13th, where we awoke and learned that all 6 of our traveling companions had made the decision overnight to get out of Dodge, so to speak. 3 of them rebooked on the direct flight Zurich-LA, and they left at 8:30 in the morning by car. And we're having our first coffee of the day and watching them depart. And then the other 3 had scheduled, one of them had scheduled, because his family, he's Austrian, and his family lives in Vienna, that he was driving back to Vienna. So the 3 of them jumped in his car around 10 o'clock in the morning, and off to Vienna they went, leaving my wife and I as sort of the last men standing.
When did the establishments around you really begin to shift into quarantine?
Well, that started to become pretty obvious that Friday afternoon, and we talked with the hotelier where we stayed, and pretty much he shared with us that the Austrian government was closing down all Austrian ski resorts and the sort of contingent amenities, be it hotels, be it restaurants, be it bars, as of that Sunday, the 15th. So we were scheduled out on the 14th. It was all happening seemingly in Austria on the 15th. We talked to our hotel in Switzerland where we were heading, and we got the green light to come. So over the course of the day on Friday the 13th and into the morning of the 14th, we opted at least to stay on schedule, realizing we had to go through the Zurich airport either way. So Saturday morning, we boarded the motor coach and headed to the Zurich airport. And we got across the Swiss border with no problem. 4 days later, that was a huge problem in retrospect. But as we arrived in Zurich at the airport, unloaded all of our gear. We're sitting in the terminal. It was a quiet terminal, not a lot of freneticism, but you could definitely feel the tension rising. At that point, we reflected, talked it through for about an hour and opted to stay with everything we had. We had been checking with British Airways on a regular basis. Our flights were still scheduled to depart the following Thursday, the 19th. So we just hired our car and drove into central Switzerland.
So as you continued to make your way back to America, what was the process of leaving Europe like as tensions had begun to mount?
Right. So I'll give you a couple of, sort of benchmark high water marks. On Monday, the 16th, I went down for coffee in our hotel in Switzerland. By the way, the staff there was unbelievable. They welcomed us unbelievably. We did get notification that all the Swiss ski resorts had closed that Sunday, but we were so low, if you will, in terms of elevation, that the resorts near us were going to be closed in any event. But it was really Monday morning. I went down for coffee and serendipitously shared coffee with the CEO of the hotel, and we struck up a conversation. And he informed me that the Swiss government was in meetings at that moment in time, and that sometime that afternoon there would be an announcement by the Swiss government, which actually occurred at 5 p.m. on Monday afternoon, the 16th, that all hotels, restaurants, bars, public gathering places other than essentials, supermarkets and such, would be closing that Tuesday morning, the 17th. Given that news, two questions were obvious. We weren't scheduled to depart until Thursday morning, the 19th, which theoretically could have left us with 2 nights and nowhere to go except our car. When I asked the CEO the question, he 100% assured me that we would be able to stay through our scheduled departure date, that the hotel closure, while their restaurants, their bars, their swimming pools, spa facility, all of those sorts of things were closing down, we would be allowed to stay. He just was not taking in any new guests and was taking now the initiative to literally shut down his hotel for the foreseeable future.
What was your arrival to Heathrow like? How did people working in London seem to be feeling?
Well, that's a really good question and a real relevant part of the story. We were scheduled out of Geneva, not Zurich. So we drove down to Geneva's airport on the Thursday morning, got into the terminal. It was, I won't say a ghost town, but very, very low population. Many of the check-in counters were closed. British Airways was open, and we got to the check-in counter and were told that our outbound flight to London Heathrow was delayed. We came to learn after the fact that the reason for that delay was that this particular plane shuttled back and forth between Heathrow and Geneva over the course of every day, so call it 5 or 6 times a day. And as they were pushing back in Heathrow to come to Geneva, the Swiss government announced that any non-Swiss citizen coming into the country would be denied entry. So our plane had to go back to the gate and deplane 5 non-Swiss citizens, which accounted for the delay in their arrival. In talking through the options with the British Airways folks in Geneva, we all agreed that even though we had a tight connection, we would get on the plane and head to Heathrow. They alerted British Airways on the ground in Heathrow that we were coming. And I think at that point, again, knowing now what I didn't know then, in retrospect, every airline, every airport was endeavoring to get citizens returned to their home countries as soon as possible. And that was absolutely the case with BA and Heathrow. So when we arrived at our gate in London, we were met by a young gentleman, I don't know, early 30s, who escorted us through the labyrinth of Terminal 5 in Heathrow, which is up and down lifts, up and down escalators, through a couple of different immigration / passport control points. along with, a typical airport shuttle train that had to get us from point A to point B. Had we not been met by that individual, Sarah, there is no way we would have made our connection. And by the way, our flight to LA that afternoon was the last one until the next day. So missing that flight was 100% not an option. The one very interesting thing, and this is, firsthand experience, as we were working our way through the arrival terminal at Heathrow, the young man who had, as we came to learn, been working in Heathrow for 5 years, was very experienced in terms of moving passengers around and understanding the ins and outs of the terminal itself. And arguably Heathrow in London is one of the top 5, if not one of the top 3 international airport hubs globally. So it wasn't a surprise really to see Heathrow, I won't say bustling, but it was certainly more populated than Geneva was. And as we walked through the terminal, this young man sort of volunteered, because I sort of asked him, I said, well, what's the mood here in Heathrow? I mean, you're helping us, but there's tons of international travelers in this airport, and where are they going and how are they getting there and all of that. He said, well, amazingly, Heathrow at that moment in time, and bear in mind, this is, Thursday, March 19th, literally 2 weeks plus 1 day ago, was kind of operating business as usual. All of the duty-free shops were open for business and people were moving around. We saw some masks, but certainly not the prevalence that we would expect to see today. And as we continue to sort of, kibitz with the young man on our way to our departure gate, he shared with us that the US travel ban, which was instituted in late January, I want to say the 29th of January, which restricted travel from China into the US, his perspective as a Brit working in Heathrow was that the US decision to do that was way ahead of the curve, and that unfortunately the rest of the international airport hubs in non-US locations were pretty slow on the uptake. And he called out Heathrow in that regard. He said, I wish, and all of my friends who work in international airports in Europe, as well as those friends I have who work in international airports in the US, wish we'd all had done that immediately following the lead of the US. And this was completely unsolicited. And I took a step back and I went, wow, that is so different than the news feeds we've been getting over the last 5 or 6 days. And the beauty of that was this was firsthand information. I'm the messenger here. I'm just sharing what I was told, which was really sort of a stark reminder, and a good reminder that a calmness and sort of a prudent but thoughtful approach to what your next step would be was really important. And for us, the two of us traveling, we opted in early on to sort of, feel our way along, if you will, sort of rely on that sort of what might have been a scratchy feeling, as opposed to reacting to what was clearly rising fear and in some locations outright panic. And that decision to stay the course served us really well, because once we got to our departure gate in Heathrow, we loaded on. The plane was about a quarter full. We took off on time for LAX, and the British Airways staff on board couldn't have been more helpful, couldn't have been more hospitable. No masks, no gloves, just business as usual, but recognizing that tensions were high and that their job was to make the flight as calm and peaceful as possible. And kudos to the British Airways flight attendants and staff. They were awesome.
Tell me about your arrival to LAX, which can be a pretty bustling airport in its own right. What was it like when you landed?
Right. Well, the expectation was we were mentally prepared for an ordeal when we got to LA. We had no idea what the reality was going to be. We'd only had the benefit of, news stories over the past few days of US airports being completely clustered, the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing, people bumping into each other, all the worst you could imagine. And we said, you know what? It is what it is. When we land, we're just going to follow the protocol. Once we got to our gate in LA on time, actually a few minutes early, they deplaned us in groups because at the exit ramp, each group was met by essentially hazmated suits, masked medical personnel. We provided each a form for each of us, name, rank, serial number, passport number, and what countries we had visited. We asked if we were asked and answered a few more what I would call rudimentary questions. I was swiped on my forehead for temperature, not my wife, and that was about a 5-minute process, and we were free to go. We then moved our way through, the longish walk to passport control, and that's where it became pretty interesting because at that point, there was obviously attention to and management of what has become the norm of social distancing, not true in the passport control line. There were hundreds of us, multiple flights coming in. They did have passport folks diverting us to appropriate terminals or reception desks at passport control based on the flight you were on. But we were standing in line for probably a half an hour. And the line moved along, but we were 12, 18 inches apart with hundreds of people. Very few masks, very few gloves, although all of the authorized personnel were wearing masks and gloves, including passport control. Once we got through passport control, straight to luggage claim, all our luggage was there. So 70 minutes literally from the time we deplaned to the time we arrived at our car in the parking garage, jumped in the car and drove the 2 hours home to San Diego. All in all, that day could have been a complete nightmare. And although it was long, and although we went through 3 international airports, when we exited the airport, we had been given cards on protocols. And because we had been traveling internationally, we were required to self-isolate for 14 days. And I'm pleased to tell you that ended at midnight last night. We are clear, good to go, cleared for takeoff, if you will. But it was an amazing experience to have lived it firsthand. And I'll my sort of top line messaging here is news is news. You have to take that news with a grain of salt, with some wisdom, certainly with a calm perspective. We could have easily gotten all riled up, if you will, and opted to try to rebook and try to cancel and do all that sort of thing. But neither of us really felt the need to do that. And as it turned out, our decision to stay the course was 100% the right decision for us. I'm not saying it would have been the right decision for everybody, but it certainly was for us. And, we're thankful and grateful that we've cleared the 14-day quarantine, but it was really an amazing experience. And on balance, the vacation was awesome and kind of made more interesting given the whole scenario around the world.
Well, Carl, very glad to hear that you are safe and that you have made it through the 14-day self-quarantine. And thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you.